Hey everybody, my name is Philip. Earlier this year I started a journey through God's Word, one chapter at a time. I wanted to see if I could pull out some real life lessons that we can use in our lives today. So whether you have read the Bible for years or you're new to God's Word, my intention is to break down each chapter as simply and as clearly as I possibly can and try to leave us with some takeaways that we can use in our life. So I hope these videos are beneficial to you in some way, and I hope you enjoy them. Welcome back, everybody. We are in a brand new book of the Bible, 1 Chronicles chapter 14. I don't know why I get my pointer fingers up like this. I just get so pumped. I'm just like, I just want to drive it in. Let's cut that part out. Cut that out, team. There's nobody here. All right, so we're back in 1 Chronicles 14, and I'm going to start off by reading verse 1, and then we will summarize the rest of this chapter for you. Verse 1, the king Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David along with cedar timber, the stonemasons, and carpenters to build him a palace. So this guy's like, hey, here's a bunch of materials and people to build you a palace. So David has just been crowned king of all of Israel, and the whole world is watching him. So this King Hiram fella over in Tyre, he's a powerful monarch, but he's not just being friendly. This is also an act of political recognition. See, by sending these skilled laborers and these fine materials, King Hiram is basically saying, David, I see you. I recognize you. You're the real deal. But it's also important to call out what's in verse 2, because this is sort of the heart of the chapter. Verse 2 says this, and David realized that the Lord had confirmed him as king over Israel and had greatly blessed his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. See, this verse right here is crucial because David's not crediting his political savvy or his military strength. He's recognizing the divine hand of God that's behind his rise. That phrase that says, for the sake of all his people Israel, it reveals God's motive that David's success isn't about just David. It's about God's faithfulness to his entire people. So it's not just a story of an ambitious warrior king, it's a story of a man who realizes he's a vessel to be used by God for God's covenant purpose. Moving on down to verse 3, we get a list of David's wives and children in Jerusalem. And among that list are Nathan and Solomon. Yes, that's Solomon, the wisest king, the wisest person to ever live, the future king and the builder of the temple. Now, it's also worth pointing out that while the multiplication of all these wives for David was a cultural norm at the time, it hints at future problems. See, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, it says this in God's law, the king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. So this is a later seed that will later sprout into disaster, especially with Solomon. And while the section seems like a flex of some sorts, it foreshadows cracks in the foundation for David. Alright, starting in verse 8, there's starting to be a little bit of drama ramping up here. The Philistines, they hear that David's been anointed king over all Israel, and so they go up to search for David. It says in verse 8 that they mobilized all their forces to capture David, but David was told they were coming, so he marched out to meet them. So it's a full-blown invasion. The Philistines are ancient enemies of Israel. You guys remember that fella named Goliath. He was a Philistine. They look at David as a threat, and they launch sort of a preemptive strike against David. Now, how does David respond to this? Well, interestingly enough, he doesn't rush right into the battle. He does something crazy. He prays. Let's see. In verse 10 it says, so David asked God, should I go out and fight the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And then God clearly answers him. It says, yes, go ahead, I will hand them over to you. So what follows is basically a supernatural rout of these Philistines who are attacking. So they went up to the place called Baal Perazim. David struck them all down there. And David said, God has broken through my enemies like a bursting flood. And they named the place Baal Perazim because it literally means the Lord who bursts through. So David literally names the place after God's explosive intervention. So that's awesome. When you think about like a bursting flood, there's this divine force that's being unleashed. David didn't just win the battle. God tore through the enemy like a dam breaking loose. But it was cool because it was God's power and not David's. And I just think it's really interesting because David took the time and prayed and he asked God, guide me in this situation. And because of that, God not only defeated the Philistines, but he just wiped them out. The Philistines even took off so fast they abandoned their idols, probably small statues carried into battle as, like a lucky charm or something like that. But David, he had them burned. No compromise, no trophies. Israel's king is not here to mingle with false religions. He's here to exalt the one and only God and him alone. But as we move down into verse 13, we see that the Philistines aren't quite done yet. It says, "But after a while the Philistines returned and raided the valley again, and once again David asked God what to do." So here the Philistines are, they're back for more. It gets a little bit more intense because what's interesting is David doesn't assume that, hey, God, you defeated them before, so you're just going to do it again. Instead, he goes back to God and he asks him a second time, "God, what do you want me to do here?" And God responds to him in verse 14, "Do not attack them straight on," God replied. "Instead, circle around behind and attack them near the poplar trees. When you hear a sound like marching feet in the tops of the poplar trees, then go out and attack. That will be the signal that God is moving ahead of you to strike down the Philistine army." So this time, God gives them a new strategy. It's a surprise attack through the trees. But God says something that's sort of interesting here. When you hear footsteps on top of the trees, that will be your sign that God is going before you to defeat the Philistines. So you see what's happening here is the sound of the marching in the treetops is the sound of the angelic army of God moving ahead of Israel. This really drives home the point that the battle belongs to the Lord, and in this case, quite literally. So David's military success is starting to really ramp up, and it's becoming global news. But what's interesting in verse 17 is it says this: "David's fame spread everywhere, and the Lord caused all the nations to fear David." So the person that wrote this is really careful to say that it was the Lord who made the nations fear David. So David's rising, but not because of his own ego or empire building. He's rising because he's God's chosen king, and the nations around him are taking notice. All right, that's the end of chapter 14. So there was a few things that I saw in this story of David that I think we can use in our own lives. The first one was just this idea that David was depending on God. When he got into situations where he was going into battle, he stopped, took a minute, he asked God, "What do you want me to do?" There's so many times in my life where I'm presented with a situation and I just make a rash decision and I don't take the time to stop and ask God, "God, what is the right thing here? What would you like me to do? How would you like me to proceed?" And I just feel like, how would my life look different if I made sure to include God in all those decisions day to day? So anyhow, David depended on God. The other thing that was really interesting to point out is that God had a dynamic strategy. He didn't use the same strategy twice in dealing with the Philistines. I think for us, it reminds us that our relationship with God requires listening, not just a formula. If God does something for you one way and then you deal with something similar later on, it's important to go back to God and ask him what his input is and not assume that he wants you to make the same decisions that you had before. Hopefully that made sense. The other thing that I thought was interesting was the part where they renamed the name of the place Baal Perazim, which means the Lord who bursts through. The Lord who bursts through. I think even just the name of this place is one of the most powerful things I've heard, because it shows that when God moves, nothing can hold him back, which is just really, really cool. And last but not least, I think we see that God fights for his people. This part at the end where he says to listen for footsteps at the top of the trees, and that will be your sign that that God is moving ahead of you to fight the battle for you. God's not just sitting around watching from heaven, telling David what moves to make like some battle commander somewhere, but he's leading the charge. He's going out before David. He's defeating the Philistines and ultimately giving himself the glory and using David as a tool to be able to do that purpose, which is really cool. I believe that God will fight your battles for you. I believe that God will fight my battles for me. But how much are we really depending on him? How much are we going to him and asking him to do those things for us? That's the challenge for me today. That's my challenge for you. I hope you have a great day, and won't he do it?